Humans smiled as diplomats, but the galaxy learned they were apex predators. The human delegate was already inside the chamber before the door finished opening. That was the first thing I noticed. Not her face, not her clothing, not the diplomatic sash across her shoulder that marked her as a representative of the planet called Earth. It was the way she moved through a room full of strangers from a dozen different species, many of them twice her size, and acted as though none of it was remarkable at all. My name is Vethkala. I have served the Sorathi Conclave as a senior diplomatic observer for 31 years. I have attended 214 formal first contact proceedings. I have watched species arrive trembling, arrive boasting, arrive hiding behind layers of security drones and encrypted signal shields. I have seen fear dressed as confidence, and confidence that was nothing but hollow performance. I believed, after 3 decades of this work, that I could read any species within the first few minutes of watching them. I was wrong about humans. It took me years to understand what I had actually seen on that first day, and I am still not entirely sure I understand all of it even now. The date was the 14th cycle of the Arith Accord meetings. The Grand Conclave of Arith Station had been in session for 11 days, addressing trade boundary disputes between the Velun Collective and the Drath Sovereignty. It was not a peaceful summit. The Drath had arrived with a fleet visible from the station's outer observation rings, and the Velun delegation had responded by refusing to enter any room that shared a wall with a Drath representative. My job, as always, was to observe, record, and report to the Sorathi High Council. Humanity had been granted observer status 4 months earlier, after a survey team confirmed that Earth had developed faster-than-light travel. Protocol allowed new species to send 1 vessel and 2 representatives to the conclave as non-voting witnesses. Most species, in my experience, used this opportunity to impress. They brought large ships. They brought elaborate ceremonial uniforms. One species had arrived in a vessel shaped like their homeworld deity. The symbolism was not subtle. Humanity sent a ship the size of a Sorathi courier. It had no visible weapon systems, which several delegates remarked upon with either admiration or suspicion, depending on their nature. Its hull was a plain gray-white, with the letters representing Earth's governing body painted along the side in a script that our translators had already processed. And from that small, plain ship, 2 humans stepped onto Arith Station. The woman was called Delegate Nora Aldrin. She was of average height for a human, which meant she reached approximately chest level on most of the Drath and stood nearly equal to a Sorathi. She had brown hair pulled back from her face, and she wore a deep blue formal jacket over a white undershirt. No ornamentation beyond a small silver pin on her lapel. Her companion was a young man named Cal Whitmore, introduced as her interpreter, though he spoke the common galactic tongue so well that an interpreter seemed unnecessary. She entered the chamber, looked around the room, and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a diplomatic performance smile, the kind that species use as a greeting signal they have practiced without understanding. She smiled the way someone smiles when they arrive somewhere they had been looking forward to reaching. Then she walked directly to the Velun delegation, introduced herself, and asked them to explain the trade dispute from the beginning, as though she genuinely wanted to know. The Velun were so surprised they actually told her. Over the next 3 days, I watched Nora Aldrin do things I had never seen a first contact observer do. She arrived early to every session. She stayed late. She asked questions that were not required of an observer. She remembered the personal names of every delegate's aide, not just the delegates themselves. When the Drath senior diplomat, a towering creature named Gur Solith, made a remark intended to belittle the Velun representative, Nora said something quiet to Gur Solith in a tone I could not hear, and he did not make another such remark that session. I do not know what she said. I have thought about it many times since. On the 3rd evening, there was a social gathering in the station's common hall. These events were always tense. Put 24 representatives of species who have been arguing over resource lanes into a room with food and informal seating, and the result is rarely comfortable. I attended, as always, out of professional obligation. Nora Aldrin was at the center of a group of 6 delegates from 4 different species, and they were laughing. Not politely, actually laughing. She had apparently said something about her journey to the station that had struck all of them as genuinely funny. I edged close enough to catch the tail end of it, something about the ship's navigation system and the pilot's insistence on announcing every minor course correction over the internal speaker, and I found myself almost smiling, which was not something I typically did at diplomatic social events. Then Gersolith crossed the room. He was not in a social mood. He had lost a procedural argument that afternoon, and he carried his frustration the way his species always did, in the set of his shoulders and the direction of his gaze. He walked toward the group, placed one large hand on Nora's arm, and told her in a low voice that her questions during the session had been inappropriate for an observer, and that if she persisted, he would personally request her removal from the conclave. He was gripping her arm, not lightly. She looked down at his hand. Then she looked up at his face. Then she reached up, took his hand in both of hers, removed it from her arm as though it were a coat she was hanging up, and held it for just a moment before releasing it. She was still smiling. She said, "I appreciate you telling me directly. That is exactly the kind of honesty that makes these conversations worth having. I'll be more careful about my phrasing in formal session." Gersolith stared at her for a long moment, then he walked away. I was watching her heart rate on the biosensor display embedded in my diplomatic sleeve, because I had quietly activated it when Gersolith approached, as standard precaution. Gersolith's species registers physiological threat response through elevated heat signature and pulse rate. His numbers had been elevated. Nora Aldrin's numbers had not changed at all. Later that night, I opened my private observation log and wrote a single line. Either she felt no fear, or she controls it perfectly. I am not sure which one I should be more interested in. An older delegate from the Myrath Council found me in the corridor afterward, as I was returning to my quarters. He was one of the most experienced diplomatic representatives in the conclave, a species with 2 centuries of galactic relations behind them. He said without preamble, "You were watching the human." I said that I had been. He looked down the corridor in the direction she had gone and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I pulled our archive records on their planet when their observer application came through. You should do the same." He paused. "I have seen many species come to this table for the first time. Most of them are afraid, whether they show it or not. Afraid of us, afraid of the Drath, afraid of making a mistake. That woman is not afraid. I have been trying to decide if that is because she is naive or because she has no reason to be." I asked him which he thought it was. He looked at me with the expression of someone sharing information they would rather not know themselves. "Read the archive," he said, "then you tell me." Cal Whitmore knocked on my door at the 7th hour of the next morning cycle, holding 2 containers of a hot liquid that humans apparently consumed with regularity. He handed me one without asking if I wanted it. "Nora wanted me to check if you had any questions about our presence here," he said. "She noticed you watching us." I told him I was an observer. Watching was my function. He smiled. It was the same kind of smile she had, easy, comfortable, entirely unforced. "Fair enough," he said and left. I held the container for a moment. It smelled warm and slightly sharp. I set it on my desk and went to find the archive. I want to be clear about something before I describe what I found. I am not easily unsettled. My career has involved direct observation of species with bioluminescent threat displays, species that communicate by releasing chemical signals that affect the nervous systems of nearby organisms. And one memorable first contact event involving a species that had developed intelligence through a hive structure and experienced my presence as an intrusion into their collective mind. I have learned to remain calm in the face of the unusual. What I found in the Galactic Natural Archive that morning was not unusual. It was methodical and scientific, and written in the dry language of xenobiology survey reports. It was more unsettling than anything I had encountered in 31 years. The planet Earth is cataloged in the archive under the designation Sol 3, Class 7. Class 7 is the highest classification in our planetary rating system. It denotes a world with extreme environmental variation, high gravitational index relative to standard, and an evolutionary history driven almost entirely by competitive predation pressure. Out of the 914 inhabited worlds currently cataloged in the archive, only 12 are classified at Class 7 or above. Earth is one of them. I had worked with representatives from 2 other Class 7 worlds in my career. Both species had arrived with significant military escorts and spent the first 6 sessions of any negotiation establishing, clearly and without room for misunderstanding, exactly what they were capable of if pushed. I had filed reports on both encounters describing them as challenging but manageable provided appropriate deference was maintained. I pulled up Earth's full biological survey file. The survey had been conducted by a remote drone team approximately 240 years ago, when Earth had not yet developed interstellar travel. The drone team had observed from orbit and deployed several small atmospheric probes to collect biological data. Their report ran to several thousand pages. I did not read all of it. I read enough. Earth's surface is divided between land and water, with the water covering the larger portion. The land portions experience temperature ranges that would be lethal to most known sentient species without technological assistance. Parts of the planet freeze to temperatures that solidify atmospheric moisture. Other parts reach temperatures that would cause cellular breakdown in S-Sorathi tissue within minutes. Large portions of the planet's surface are actively hostile to life in ways that seem almost deliberate. Extreme weather events, geological instability, sustained drought, flooding. And yet Earth has more species of complex life than any other Class 7 world on record. The life there did not adapt to avoid the hostile conditions. It adapted to survive them, and then it kept going. The dominant animal groups on Earth's land surface had, at the time of the survey, evolved into a state of near-constant competition. Every ecological zone the survey probes examined was shaped by predator-prey relationships of remarkable complexity. The archive entry on Earth's predators was longer than the entries for most entire planets. I searched the record for humans. They were listed, as I had expected, as one of Earth's many primate species. What I had not expected was the classification beside their entry. Every other species on Earth was listed as either predator or prey, with most falling into both categories depending on context. Humans were listed under a third category. The archive used the term superpredator and included a footnote explaining that this designation was applied to species that had effectively removed themselves from the natural food chain by eliminating, controlling, or domesticating every other species in their ecological zone that could pose a threat to them. The footnote was 4 sentences long. 3 of those sentences were about humans. I sat back and looked at that word for a while. Then I kept reading. Human anatomy, according to the survey report, was poorly suited for survival on Earth by most standard metrics. They had no natural armor. Their outer covering, a thin layer called skin, provided almost no protection against temperature extremes, abrasion, or physical impact. Their bones were relatively fragile compared to other large animals on their planet. They had no venom, no natural weapons beyond hands with limited grip strength, and no passive defense systems. They were, on paper, one of the more vulnerable large animals on their world. And yet the survey report noted, in the careful language of science trying to explain something counterintuitive, that humans had achieved ecological dominance on their planet approximately 12,000 years before the survey was conducted, and had maintained it without interruption since. The report's authors had tried to explain this. Their explanation occupied 40 pages and can be summarized in 3 points. First, humans have exceptional endurance. Most predators on Earth hunt in short, high-speed bursts and require recovery time afterward. Humans, through a mechanism involving sweat glands distributed across most of their body surface, can regulate their internal temperature during sustained physical activity far more effectively than almost any other animal on their planet. In practical terms, this means a human can pursue a target for hours across open terrain without stopping, long after the target has been forced to rest. The survey team called this persistence hunting. They noted that it had been humans' primary food-gathering strategy for tens of thousands of years before they developed other methods. I thought about Nora Aldrin walking into a room full of species she had never met, showing no fatigue, no hesitation. I thought about the word persistence. Second, humans have a high tolerance for physical pain relative to other species on their world. The survey report was careful to clarify that humans feel pain normally, and that it serves the same biological function it does in most animals, as a warning signal. But human behavioral response to pain is unusual. Their nervous system appears to have developed a capacity to continue functioning under conditions that would cause most species to cease activity entirely. The report cited examples from their recorded history, which the survey team had accessed through early radio and electronic transmissions. Humans continuing to function after injuries, completing tasks under conditions that should have incapacitated them, recovering from damage that would be fatal to most comparable-sized animals. I thought about Cal Whitmore's jaw, the healed scar. Whatever had made that mark had been significant. He had not only survived it, he had healed so completely that he could smile and carry hot drinks and make easy conversation, and unless you looked closely at the line of old tissue along his jaw, you would never know anything had happened to him at all. Third, and the point the survey report returned to several times with what read like reluctant fascination, humans cooperate. This is not unique among social species. Many animals cooperate within their own group. What made human cooperation remarkable, according to the survey team, was its scale and its flexibility. Humans cooperated with members of their species they had never met. They cooperated across what the survey team identified as hundreds of distinct cultural and linguistic groups. They developed systems, written and later electronic, for coordinating behavior among millions of individuals who shared no direct personal bond. And when they cooperated toward a specific goal, the survey team noted, the results were disproportionate to what any individual or small group among them could achieve. The survey team's concluding note on human cooperation was the line I read 3 times before I moved on. It said, "This species does not cooperate because they lack the capacity for individual action. They cooperate because they have determined that cooperation produces better outcomes. The distinction is important. A species that cooperates out of necessity stops cooperating when necessity ends. A species that cooperates by choice does not." I closed the physical biology section and opened the historical record the survey team had compiled. Humans had not always cooperated with each other. Their recorded history, which spanned several thousand years at the time of the survey, was largely a record of conflict between different human groups. They had developed weapons of extraordinary destructive capacity, used them on each other, rebuilt, and developed further weapons. The survey team had flagged this as a concern. A species capable of that level of self-directed harm, and also possessed of the biological characteristics described in the preceding sections would, they noted, be extremely dangerous if its destructive tendencies were directed outward rather than inward. But something had changed, the survey team observed. In the centuries immediately preceding the survey, human conflict had decreased significantly. Not disappeared, but decreased. The species had developed governing structures that discouraged intergroup conflict by making cooperation economically advantageous. They had built agreements between their groups that, imperfectly but persistently, held. They had not become peaceful. The capacity for conflict was still clearly present, documented in their history and in the ongoing maintenance of significant military capability. But they had, The survey team concluded with apparent surprise, chosen to redirect most of that capacity elsewhere. The survey's final note read, "It is the opinion of this team that Sol-3 humanity is not a species that has evolved beyond its predatory nature. It is a species that has learned to manage that nature with considerable sophistication. The smile, as this team has come to think of it, is genuine. So is everything beneath it. Approaching this species as though only the smile is real would be an error of significant magnitude." I sat in my records room for a long time after I finished reading. I thought about Nora Aldrin removing Gersolith's hand from her arm, the calm, the heart rate that did not change, the smile that came right back, immediate and real. I thought about 12,000 years of ecological dominance on a Class 7 world. I thought about the fact that she had come here, to a station full of species she had never met, representing a planet that no one had invited into the galactic community yet, and she had walked into that chamber like she was returning somewhere familiar. I opened my observation log and added a line beneath the one I had written the night before. "These are not creatures that learned to speak and then tried to act civilized. They are something that was shaped by one of the most demanding environments in the catalogued galaxy, survived it completely, and then decided on their own that talking was worth trying. They did not leave the other thing behind. They brought it with them. They simply keep it very quiet." I closed the log. I was still thinking about the hot drink Cal Whitmore had left on my desk that morning, the easy way he had handed it over without asking, the assumption of welcome. I thought, for the first time since beginning my career, that I was genuinely uncertain how to proceed with an observation assignment. I decided to keep watching and to be more careful about what I assumed I was seeing. The emergency signal came through on a standard frequency at the 4th hour of the cycle, 11 days into the Arith Conclave proceedings. I was in the middle of drafting my nightly summary report when the alert lit up across every screen on the station simultaneously. Kethavar Station, secondary docking hub, 3 sectors from Arith. A fringe group called the Scaven Syndicate had taken the connecting transport vessel before it could depart, sealing 31 diplomatic personnel inside the docking bay and cutting external communications. The Conclave Response Coordinator's voice came over the speaker network with the practiced steadiness of someone delivering very bad news in a very controlled tone. 31 hostages, 7 species represented, among them 4 humans. Among those 4 humans, Delegate Nora Aldrin and Cal Whitmore. The chamber went quiet in the specific way that large rooms go quiet when everyone in them is recalculating something at the same time. The Scaven Syndicate was not a military organization. They were a collection of displaced traders and former colonial workers who had accumulated enough resentment and old surplus equipment to make themselves dangerous. They had done this twice before, both times targeting freight shipments, both times releasing hostages unharmed once their financial demands were met. Their pattern was clear: choose a target that looked soft, make demands, collect payment, leave. They were not ideologically motivated. They were, in the assessment of every intelligence office that tracked them, primarily opportunistic. The Conclave Response Coordinator made this point clearly in the briefing that followed the initial alert. The Syndicate had almost certainly selected the transport because it carried diplomatic personnel who would be considered high value but whose governments would prioritize their safe return over any punitive action. The Scaven were counting on compliance. They were, the coordinator suggested, almost certainly going to get it. The question was how long the process would take. I found myself calculating, without meaning to, which of the 31 hostages would be most useful to the Syndicate as leverage, and which would be considered lowest risk to harm first as a demonstration of seriousness. It was not a comfortable line of thinking. I stopped when I caught myself including Nora Aldrin and Cal Whitmore in the calculation, and realized I was assessing them the way I would assess any other hostages, which was to say as individuals whose safety depended entirely on the decisions of whoever held them. The response team assembled quickly, a combined security unit from 3 conclave member species, armed and equipped for a boarding action if necessary. The coordinator estimated a transit time of approximately 9 hours to Kethavar station from the nearest capable vessel. 9 hours was long. The coordinator said this as gently as the facts allowed. What happened inside that docking bay during those 9 hours? I did not learn until afterward, from the official debrief filed by Kethavar Station's commander, a methodical woman named Liz, whose reports I had always found reliable. The syndicate had 17 members present in the docking bay. They were armed with mid-grade equipment, the kind that was effective for intimidation but not designed for sustained confrontation. Their plan, as reconstructed from their own subsequent accounts, was straightforward. Keep the hostages grouped, make contact with the conclave, deliver demands, wait for a response. They had assigned 3 of their members to watch the humans specifically, because the humans were the only ones who did not appear frightened in the first hour. The syndicate's field leader, a man who went by the name Drev, told the debrief team that he had expected the humans to panic. Most hostages, in his experience, became either very still or very loud within the first 30 minutes. The humans had done neither. Nora Aldrin had, instead, asked Drev if anyone was hurt and whether there was water available. Drev told her there was no water. She nodded and went back to sit with the other hostages. Cal Whitmore spent the first hour and a half sitting with his back against the bay wall, saying very little, watching the syndicate members move around the room. He had the expression, one syndicate member later said, of someone doing arithmetic. Not frightened arithmetic, just arithmetic. By the second hour, Nora had introduced herself personally to all 27 non-human hostages and learned each of their names. This was not, as it might appear, merely a social gesture. The debrief established that she had, during these introductions, also determined which of the hostages had relevant skills, which were in poor physical condition, which spoke common galactic tongue fluently, and which sections of the docking bay had unmonitored sightlines. Cal had, by this point, established the patrol rotation of all 17 syndicate members. He had done this by watching and counting. He shared what he had learned with Nora in a quiet conversation that 2 syndicate guards overheard and dismissed as nervous small talk, because it sounded like nervous small talk, and because neither of them thought to wonder why a frightened person would be talking about structural support beams. By hour 4, Nora had organized the non-human hostages into 3 quiet groups based on physical capability and proximity to specific sections of the bay. She had explained the plan to each group not as a plan but as a request. She said, "If something happens, I would ask you to do this one thing, only if you feel safe doing it, and only when you see me stand up." She said it in common galactic tongue, and then Cal repeated it in 2 other languages for the members of the group who needed it. She did not say what the something was. She said they would know when they saw it. The syndicate's communications with the conclave response coordinator had not gone as expected. The coordinator had stalled, professionally and without apparent effort, for 6 hours, requesting confirmation of hostage conditions, citing procedural requirements for payment authorization, asking questions that required long answers. This was standard protocol. It was also, Rolia, as noted in her debrief, made considerably easier by the fact that the hostages were, as far as the syndicate could determine, calm and cooperative. There was no urgency from inside the bay pushing the syndicate toward rash decisions. No one was causing problems. No one was creating situations that needed managing. No one visible was doing anything at all. At the 8th hour and 43rd minute, 17 minutes before the response team's estimated arrival, a systems alert lit up in the docking bay's secondary control panel. This was not an accident. Cal Whitmore had reached it during his 3rd quiet circuit of the room, timed to a moment when the guard nearest to him had turned to respond to a question from one of the Velun hostages, a question that Nora had asked the Velun representative to ask at exactly that moment. The alert was minor, a pressure variance in the bay's atmospheric regulation system. It required one person to check the manual readout on the far wall, which was in a section of the bay that was not easily visible from the main hostage group. Drev sent one of his members to check it. That member did not return to the main group. What happened next was, according to every account gathered in the debrief, extremely fast and almost entirely quiet. The Sarathi debrief protocols require that I not speculate beyond what was confirmed in the official record, so I will state only what Roles confirmed in her report. When the response team entered the docking bay 17 minutes later, they found the following: all 31 hostages unharmed and seated together in the near section of the bay. All 17 syndicate members located in the cargo storage section at the far end of the bay. All 17 of them secured using equipment cords, atmospheric hose lengths, and the restraint belts from the transport seating, none of which were standard security equipment, and all of which were present in the bay as ordinary cargo or furnishing elements. None of the syndicate members required medical attention. None of the hostages required medical attention. Nora Aldrin was seated on a cargo crate when the response team entered. She was holding a container of water, which someone had apparently found in the transport's supply section. She stood when the team came in, gave the team leader a brief, accurate account of the situation, confirmed that all hostages were accounted for, and then sat back down. Cal Whitmore was talking quietly to one of the Velun representatives, who appeared to find the conversation calming. Roles, in her debrief, described the scene as orderly. She spent 3 pages of her report attempting to establish the exact sequence of events during the final phase of the situation, and acknowledged that she had been unable to do so completely, because no one present had been in a position to observe the full sequence, and the humans had described their role in it with what Roles called notable brevity. She spent 1 additional paragraph on the syndicate members' accounts of the experience. They had been, she wrote, unanimously consistent on one point. Not one of them could identify exactly when the situation had shifted from their control to the humans. The transition, every one of them described separately and without coordination, had felt like nothing was happening right until the moment when everything had already happened. One member said, "They looked at us like we were a problem they were solving, not like they were afraid, not like they were angry, like we were a problem and they were working out the answer." Another said in a quieter voice, "I have done this before. I know what frightened people look like. These ones were never frightened, not for a single moment." Roles's final paragraph in the official debrief report was short. She wrote, "This observer recommends no formal action against the hostages, as they acted within the limits of reasonable self-preservation. This observer also notes, for the record, that the human delegates apologized to the other hostages upon the response team's arrival. Their stated reason was that the situation had been louder than they had hoped. There was no indication that they considered this apology unusual." I read that last line twice. I added it to my observation log that night, and for a long time afterward I was not sure what note to write beneath it. Eventually I wrote, "I think I have been observing the wrong thing. I have been watching how they behave in comfortable situations. I should have been paying attention to what happens when comfort is removed." I closed the log. 3 sectors away, on a station I would not visit for another month, Nora Aldrin was probably sleeping, and the Scaven Syndicate was in custody, and 17 individuals who had counted on humans being the easiest target in the room were rethinking a great many of their assumptions. I suspected they were not the last ones who would have to do that. I want to be honest about what I was doing in that corridor. I had not followed Nora Aldrin. That would have been a misuse of my position, and I would not have done it deliberately. What happened was that I had taken the long route back from the records archive to my quarters because I wanted to think without sitting still, which is a habit I developed early in my career and have never fully explained to anyone because it sounds peculiar when said aloud. The corridor on the station's upper residential deck was usually empty at the late hour I chose to walk it. I had walked it many times before. I did not expect to hear voices. They were coming from a small alcove near the environmental control junctions, one of those functional spaces on large stations where the structural elements are visible, and the ceiling is lower, and the lighting is softer because it is not meant for meetings or presentations. I had the impression, from the position of the sound, that whoever was talking had chosen the location precisely, because it was unlikely to have anyone passing through. I recognized Nora's voice before I recognized her words. My instinct was to make myself known, as courtesy required. I took one step forward and then stopped, because the tone of what I was hearing was so different from anything I had heard from her before that I genuinely did not, for a moment, recognize it as the same person. She was not performing. That was the word that came to me, and it stayed. In every setting I had observed her in, there was a quality to her manner that I had always registered as warmth, and it was real warmth. I want to be clear about that, but I understood now, hearing her without it, that warmth was also a choice she made consciously in every room she entered. Here, in the alcove, speaking to someone she trusted completely in a space she believed was private, she was not making that choice. She was just thinking out loud, and what I heard was not coldness exactly, it was precision, the same mind without the softening layer around it. The other voice was someone I did not immediately recognize, a man named Owen Clare, I learned later, who was the human delegation's strategic coordinator. He had been present at the conclave for most of its duration, but had stayed largely in the background, handling logistics, the way good coordinators always do. I should have announced myself and left. I will not pretend otherwise. I stayed long enough to hear what I heard, and I have thought about it every day since, and I believe it is the most important thing I recorded in 31 years of observation work. Not the most dramatic thing, not the most unsettling thing, the most important thing, because it changed what I understood about what I had been watching. Owen was asking her about the Drath. Specifically, he was asking whether she thought Gersolith's recent shift in negotiating posture was genuine or tactical. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had that low, even quality, the one I recognized now as her actual thinking voice rather than her communicating voice. She said that it was probably both. She said that the Drath wanted to be seen moving toward cooperation because the broader conclave approval that would follow was worth more to them right now than the short-term advantage of holding their current position, so the shift was tactical. But she also said that Gersolith personally had grown tired, and tired senior diplomats sometimes became genuine peacemakers simply because they did not have the energy to keep up the alternative, and that was worth taking seriously and treating as real even if it had started as performance. Owen asked which species she thought were genuinely committed to the Accord framework. She went through 7 of them. Her assessments were rapid, specific, and showed a depth of understanding of each species' internal political pressures that took me several seconds to fully absorb each time. She was not summarizing what she had read in briefing files. She was describing what she had learned by being in rooms with these delegations, watching, listening, asking questions about their home systems and their histories, and their concerns that no one had thought to flag as intelligence gathering, because they were asked with such evident interest that they sounded like conversation. About the Sorathi, she said, Vethkala is a genuinely honest observer. He is also more curious than he realizes. I would say we have about 60% of his confidence right now, and the other 40 will come if we don't do anything that makes him feel his curiosity was misplaced. He values accuracy more than comfort, which means the best approach is just to be accurate. I stood very still in the corridor. Owen asked, and the Drath realistically. Nora said, they are not going to trust us. That is not the goal with them. The goal is to be so clearly not worth the cost of a conflict that they file us in the category of things they have decided not to deal with. We do not need them to like us. We need them to conclude on their own, through their own reasoning, that engaging with us is more trouble than it is worth. We work toward that by being visibly useful to everyone around them while being completely unavailable as a target. Once they believe both of those things simultaneously, they will make the right decision and they will believe it was their idea. She paused. That is actually the preferred outcome, she said. People who do things because they want to are more reliable than people who do things because they were persuaded. The best result is always when the other person thinks they decided. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you ever get tired of thinking about all of it this way?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said finally. "This is the easier version. The version I don't want to use is considerably more tiring." I did not wait to hear what she meant by that. I had already stayed longer than I should have, and I had already understood more than I had expected to understand. I walked back down the corridor the way I had come, which was longer, and went to my quarters and sat down at my desk in the dark for a while without turning the lights on. Here is what I had understood. I had spent 3 weeks studying Nora Aldrin as a diplomat, watching her technique, nodding her methods, filing observations about her effectiveness and her approach. I had been impressed. I had also been, I realized, watching the surface of something very much deeper than I had given it credit for. What I had heard in the alcove was not a different person. It was the same person, operating without the performance layer, and the performance layer was something she added deliberately, not because she was deceptive, but because she understood that people communicate better when they feel comfortable, and making people feel comfortable was simply a skill she had developed and chose to use because it worked. The warmth was real. The calculation was also real. These were not contradictions in her. They were components. I thought about the archive report, the survey team's line about the smile and what was beneath it. I thought about 12,000 years of ecological dominance on one of the most demanding worlds in the catalog. I thought about a species that had spent millennia figuring out how to cooperate with other members of itself, not because they were naturally cooperative, but because they had determined it was more effective, and who had then arrived in a galaxy full of strangers and applied the same reasoning to the entire situation. The gift-giving, the learning of names, the genuine laughter and the easy manner, all of it was real, and all of it was also in the most precise sense of the word strategy, not manipulation, strategy. There was a difference, and the difference mattered because manipulation implied that the warmth was false. The warmth was not false. It was simply not the whole picture. I opened my observation log and wrote for a long time. Near the end of what I wrote, I recorded this. I have been making a consistent error in my observation method. I have been treating diplomacy and capability as separate categories and assigning humans primarily to the first. I believe the more accurate model is that they are the same category for this species, expressed simultaneously in the same room with the same face. The smile is real. The assessment behind the smile is also real. They do not experience these as contradictory. Then I wrote, I wonder if this is what made them so effective on their own world. Not that they were stronger or faster or better protected than everything else, but that they were always doing two things at once, and only one of those things was ever visible. I closed the log and sat in the dark for a while longer. At some point, I noticed that the container Cal Whitmore had given me 3 weeks ago was still on the corner of my desk. I had never disposed of it. I had set it there that first morning and left it, and somehow in the movement of work and meetings and accumulating observations, it had remained. I thought about the easy way he had handed it to me, the assumption of welcome, not an assumption, I understood now, a calculation that had looked exactly like an assumption. I turned the lights on. I was going to have a great deal to think about before I filed my next report to the High Council, and I suspected that, this time, the report would take considerably longer to write than usual. I am writing this 12 years after that night in the corridor on Arith Station. My official observation reports are filed in the Es-Sorathi High Council's archive, 7 years of them covering human participation in the conclave, and they are thorough and accurate, because accuracy was always what I valued most, and Nora Aldrin, as it turned out, had known that about me before I fully knew it about myself. What the official reports contain is the record of what happened. What I am writing now is the record of what it meant. Humanity's first decade as a full conclave member was, by any measurable standard, a remarkable period in galactic diplomatic history. They negotiated 14 significant agreements between species that had been in various states of dispute for generations. They established a conflict mediation framework that is still used today. They built, through the kind of patient, persistent relationship building that the archive report had described as one of their defining characteristics, a network of alliances and goodwill that no species had assembled in anything close to their time. They also, quietly, established themselves as a presence that no one chose to test twice. This was not accomplished through open shows of military force. The human delegation never arrived anywhere with a visible fleet. They never issued formal threats. They never, in any official capacity, described themselves as anything other than partners working toward collective stability. And this was entirely true. What was also true was a series of incidents, each individually minor, collectively unmistakable, that established, in the minds of every intelligence office in the conclave and beyond it, a very clear picture of what engaging with humans against their interests would cost. A Drath splinter faction had seized a mining platform in a disputed zone and taken 3 human surveyors along with 12 others from 2 additional species. The faction's leadership had expected the standard response: negotiations, demands, payment, release. What they received instead was a response so precisely calibrated and so efficiently executed that the operation was over before most of the conclave had processed that a response was underway. The surveyors were recovered unharmed. The faction's ability to conduct future operations was eliminated completely. The human delegation expressed regret that the situation had required resolution through force, filed a full accounting of the response with the Conclave Oversight Board, and returned to the table for the next scheduled session. There was no celebration. There was no announcement. There was, in the human delegation's manner, no observable change at all. I asked Nora about it afterward. We had developed, over 7 years of her time at the conclave, something that I would describe as a genuine professional friendship, which is a category I did not have in my experience before her and have not encountered in the same form since. She said, "We would have preferred to talk it through. That was always the first choice. When the first choice isn't available, you do what's necessary and then you come back to the table as quickly as possible. Lingering on it isn't useful." I asked her if she ever found the scale of it difficult, moving between diplomacy and the other thing, as I had come to think of it in my private notes. She thought about the question carefully, in the way she always thought about questions she was taking seriously. "It's the same thing," she said. "That's the part that took the rest of the galaxy a while to understand. When I walk into a room and try to help 2 species find an agreement that works for both of them, I am using exactly the same part of myself that I was using in that docking bay on Kethavar, reading the room, understanding what each person actually needs versus what they're saying they need, figuring out where the leverage points are and how to use them without burning the relationship. It's the same skill set, the room is just different." She paused. "We spent a very long time on our own world learning to use those skills on each other," she said. "It was not always productive. We still have the historical record of what it looked like when we used them badly. I think that history is actually part of why our diplomats tend to be good at this. We know exactly what the alternative looks like. We would like very much not to do it again." That conversation happened in my 3rd year of observing the full human delegation. By my 5th year, I had come to understand something that I do not think any of my colleagues in the S-Sorathi Observation Corps had fully articulated yet, even those who had more direct experience with humans than I did. The galaxy had made a consistent error about humanity. It was the same error the Skaven Syndicate had made on Kethavar Station. It was the error the Drath Splinter faction had made at the mining platform. It was, in various forms, the error that nearly every species made when encountering humans for the first time. The error was this: treating their apparent gentleness as evidence of their limits. It was an understandable mistake. Humans did not present as dangerous. They presented as engaged, curious, warm, and interested in talking. These were not deceptive qualities. They were all genuinely present. But the galaxy had, in its accumulated experience, developed an intuitive model in which a species that presented as gentle was gentle, and a species that presented as formidable looked formidable. The two categories were expected to be distinct. Humans were not distinct. They were both things completely at all times, and the degree to which one or the other was visible in any given moment was a choice they were making based on what the situation required. And because they had spent a very long time on a very demanding world, making exactly that kind of situation-based choice, they were extremely good at it. Nora Aldrin retired from active conclave service in the 9th year of humanity's membership. By that point, she had negotiated more agreements than any single diplomat in any species' first decade of participation, a record that still stands. She was replaced by a younger delegate named Simon Farr, who had her manner and her approach, and who had, I noted in my first observation report on him, the same quality of stillness under pressure that I had first noticed in her. I asked her, in our last formal meeting before she stepped back, whether she had trained him specifically. She said he trained himself. I just gave him room to do it. She was moving between stations by then, consulting, advising, doing the slower and less visible work of building structures that would last longer than any individual agreement. She still brought small gifts to meetings. She still learned names. I saw her one more time, 3 years after her retirement, at a small gathering on a station whose name I will not include because some of the conversations that happened there were unofficial, and I prefer to leave certain details out of the public record. I was nearly at the end of my own active career by then. She was exactly as I remembered her. The same ease, the same attentiveness, the same quality of making whoever she was talking to feel that she was genuinely glad they were there. We sat together for a while in a quiet corner of the gathering space, which neither of us had sought out deliberately, but both of us ended up in because we were, at heart, observers, and the best place to observe a room is from its edges. I asked her, finally, the question I had been holding for 12 years. I had rehearsed it many different ways. In the end, I asked it simply. I said, when you first arrived at Arith Station, all of us, all those species you had never met, did you find any of it frightening? She looked at me for a moment with the expression I had come to recognize as her actual consideration face rather than her listening face. Then she smiled. Of course, she said, that is exactly why I brought gifts. I sat with that for a moment. And the other thing, I asked, the part of you that was also doing the calculation. She tilted her head slightly. That was frightened too, she said. It just had more to work with. She reached into the bag beside her chair and produced a small wrapped package, which she handed to me with the same easy, unassuming gesture I had seen her use 100 times before. Inside was a small container of the hot drink Cal Whitmore had brought me on my first morning observing the human delegation. I had, she apparently knew, never actually drunk that one. I laughed. I am not sure I had ever laughed quite like that in a professional context before. She laughed too, and for a few minutes we were simply two people who had watched each other across a remarkable decade of history and found, at the end of it, that they were glad to have been paying attention. I wrote my memoir in the 2 years following that meeting. It took longer than I expected, not because I lacked material, but because I kept finding that the conclusions I had reached needed revision as I worked through the evidence more carefully. My understanding of humanity had never been wrong exactly, but it had always been slightly behind the reality. Every time I thought I had arrived at the full picture, there was another layer. I think that is probably accurate to the experience of knowing them. The galactic community took years to stop making the original error, and some parts of it are still working on it. The adjustment required changing not just how we saw humans, but how we saw the categories themselves. We had assumed, as a general principle, that gentleness and lethality were opposites, and that a species showing one was not showing the other. Humans were not the first species to challenge that assumption, but they were the most thorough in the demonstration. What they showed the galaxy, over a decade of careful, consistent, warm-smiled, fully attentive presence, was not that they had chosen talking over everything else. They had chosen talking because talking worked better, and they knew exactly what they were choosing it instead of. That knowledge, present in every room they entered, made the talking more effective, not less. Because the species across the table from them could sense it, eventually, even before they understood what they were sensing. And the thing about sitting across from someone who has made a genuine choice to be here, in this room, working toward this outcome, and who could very clearly be doing something else entirely, is that you take the conversation more seriously. You pay attention. You make the deal work. I close this memoir with the last line I wrote in my observation log. On the night of that final gathering, after I had returned to my quarters and sat in the same dark that I had sat in 12 years before on a Rith station. The galaxy learned, eventually, what humanity had always known, which is that the most significant thing in any room is not the one that makes itself visible as a threat. It is the one that does not need to. The one sitting across from you with genuine warmth and complete attention, bringing something to share, learning your name, asking the right question, and holding quietly without weight or performance the full knowledge that it has options it is not using. That is what Nora Aldrin was on the first day. I saw her walk into the chamber at a Rith station. That is what she was on every day after. She was a diplomat because she chose to be. The choosing was the whole point.